I'm Brendan Lodge. I work for GSSI Parts and Leasing primarily. My role there is aircraft acquisition specialist, and since I joined, we've probably bought about 10 aircraft a year, so that's about 70 aircraft now, which we buy primarily to tear down, and we sell the parts through our business, with a major focus on acquiring good engines, which we use for many different reasons. And Ben here, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I'm Ben Newman, so I'm the Business Development Manager for In-Flight the Jet Centre. So we're an FBO and MRO based at London Stansted, specialising in Embraer. And so my plan today is to give you a bit of an overview of the lived experience from the MRO side. Oh, that was nice. And give you our side of how these work. From what I've seen from the last year's worth, we've done 7 or 8 of them. Just to offer that slight context to the MRO side.
Now, I've brought Ben in because obviously I've been working as a buyer, but I've also worked as a broker in the past. But we've got a lot of brokers in the audience, okay, and I'd be very interested if anybody wants to make any contribution to the discourse this afternoon. We're very, very pleased to hear from you, okay? So, and also the lawyers as well, Aoife, Eddie. Okay, but Aoife's going to do a slot afterwards on just tying in some of the legal sides of how the PPI works as well. So she's probably going to watch with interest what we say and then add other bits and pieces. But feel free to interject, Aoife, if you or anybody else from the legal profession. Okay. So keep it interactive if we can. Can we have the next slide, please? So I've put this picture in here because this is a proud moment of a very old aeroplane being taken delivery of. Okay, I believe it was new when this. And does anybody know Peter Turner, who retired quite recently? Yeah, that's Peter Turner taking delivery of that aeroplane. Okay, and I want to make the point that you start off with a brand new aeroplane, and Aoife made a point earlier on, which I want to emphasise because of my experiences, but never assume that a brand new aircraft is in good delivery condition. I've known several instances where they've not been, and it's been appalling. So it's always worthwhile even to put a brand new aircraft through a PPI. But anyway, the next picture kind of highlights, that's the very same aircraft, okay, many years later, and it's reached the end of its life. So we've got a situation here where you've got a brand new aeroplane, and it's reached the end of its life, and at some point it's going to be bought and sold between those 2 points. And during that time, okay, someone who buys it is going to want to know what they're buying. And it will be somewhere between brand new delivery condition and then this state that they're going to find out about. But most important, that's why I've put these pictures in. Next slide, please. So PPI, very, very simply, we get a third party to look at the aeroplane. And they tend to work for the buyer. So the buyer pays them for the base cost of the inspection, okay? And it's basically designed to ascertain that the aircraft is as described in the delivery condition. And again, earlier on, Aoife made the point that it's not just being airworthy. It's if you've said that everything works on board, then you need to be accountable for that when the PPI is done. So the delivery condition is always specified within the APA. So if you go to the next slide, okay, this is a typical clause in the APA. I've pulled it from an actual contract that I was involved in. Okay, so buyer's pre-purchase inspection of the aircraft, the inspection, shall commence within 5 days, effective of the date of the agreement, but always subject to the availability of the facilities that are going to do it, the MROs. At the moment, that's a big problem, getting a slot on a timely basis. I think that's right, isn't it? Brokers in the room?
Always difficult.
Yeah. But it's got worse since COVID, I think, hasn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
There's a shortage of engineers and everything else. That wording's in there just to protect the parties from that happening. Okay? And the seller may have to position the aircraft to the inspection facility, in which case, you're down into who's paying for that. In this case, it was going to be conducted at Textron in Wichita. Okay, and the inspection shall be conducted to determine that the aircraft is airworthy and can meet the delivery conditions defined below. Okay, so let's move on to the delivery conditions. Next slide, please. Apologies, I don't know how that sneaked through. I amended a previous, so sorry, mate.
No, it's fine.
In fact, tag engineering don't even exist anymore, do they? So, anyway, this is a typical delivery condition lifted again from an APA. So, on the closing date, the seller shall cause the aircraft to be delivered to a buyer at the delivery location with good and marketable title, free and clear of all liens and encumbrances, with all actions taken by seller that are necessary to establish buyer's ownership of the aircraft and engines. With all aircraft documents in an airworthy condition, with a current certificate of airworthiness issued by the Isle of Man Aviation Register. And I can just tell that Aoife's probably going to take issue with the airworthy condition bit there. But we got this one past the lawyers on the other side, okay? All systems and components in normal working order. So that kind of starts to pick up on things like the monitors not working, maybe a seat mechanism not working in the cabin. Okay, and with a valid export certificate of airworthiness, well, that is if we're changing registers, okay, and if required. On this occasion, it was. In compliance with the mandatory portions of all FAA airworthiness directives and mandatory service bulletins that have been issued with respect to the aircraft with due dates on or prior to the closing. And you were talking earlier on, sometimes you try to push that back to 6 months following closing. On this occasion, we didn't get that. Current as of the closing on the manufacturer's maintenance programs in effect for the aircraft on the effective date with all hourly cycle and calendar inspections required under such programs complied with, and having suffered no undisclosed material damage or material corrosion. Okay? So that is the essence. The whole purpose of the PPI is to establish that those conditions are met. Okay, next slide, please. So what happens then is, once the inspection has been made, okay, this form has to be basically executed by the purchaser. Okay, and they sign it to say the aircraft is in the condition, tick, or the aircraft is hereby rejected. Okay, so that would be on the basis of major findings, or they're going to tick the one that says if the seller fixes the aircraft, then they will proceed with the purchase. Okay, and that at that point, that is when things change and the seller becomes responsible for the rectification of the defects that have been found. Any questions so far? Next slide, please. Okay, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So when I was asked by Brendan to come along today to give an MRO's kind of viewpoint on it, I sat and did some observations internally with the engineers, with the commercial team that we have at InFlight that have got lots of experience on these. I then went out and spoke to some senior experienced brokers and friends to offer what they thought as well. So I could put a bit of a balanced argument together, be prepared for when the argument comes back from the room. Now, there was a couple of key trends that came up and that feature all the way through. I think they've been touched on already this morning quite heavily. Oliver mentioned communication, and I think that communication piece from everybody involved is key. So our communication as an MRO to buyer, seller, broker, and all of the other parties that will get involved somewhere along the lines. We do an awful lot of updates. However, who do we update? How do we update them? And who actually needs to know that piece of information? And that communication comes back from the broker at the start with either the snippet from the APA like we've just seen to lay down the law of what it is we're actually there for. But also it's then we can communicate back as to how we're making progress onto that. I'm sure everyone in the room's got experiences of positives and negatives to that side of the communication. Roles and responsibilities. So who plays what role? So we're there on behalf of the buyer, but as an independent mediatory in the middle to actually ensure that aeroplane meets the standard of requirement that's been set. So we have different levels of PPI, the same as every other MRO that any of you will have used in the past. We'll go on to one in a minute where I can go into some more detail of how that's actually structured and what we're looking at. But the responsibilities of the buyer is how do they interact with us, or what interaction do we have? We don't normally, it will go through the broker. But there are some instances where the broker will have brought the aircraft to us through the buyer or the seller, but then disappears. So some brokers we see are in every day in the facility, really helping push the sale along. Others will drop the aeroplane off on day one, and we won't see or hear from them again. And then there'll be a representative on behalf of the buyer and the seller on site or on an email, and it's how does that have a knock-on effect to the process. So a PPI, traditionally a level 3 on a legacy 650, you're looking at 10 days for the inspection. That doesn't include any rectification work or any process after, but that 10 days can become 15, 20 if we're not getting authority and approvals from either side of the house in that kind of time zone. So the MRO gets beaten with a stick from both sides, rightly so sometimes, of the aircraft's going late or timings, punctuality. All of those things have a knock-on effect, but the expectation management is the common trend, I think, for today. And it's how do we manage expectations back? So correct a PPI is 10 days, but that's an inspection. That isn't a rectification. That isn't fixing anything that's been found. Expectation management, again, we won't find anything that we're not asked and paid to look for. So we're not going to start opening cabins. We're not going to start opening panels that aren't in the PPI. Now, to get to something, you do have to go through certain areas of an aeroplane. If those areas aren't on the PPI, which they should be because we're looking at them, they will be inspected. But they're only inspected to the level that has been set by the buyer and agreed by the seller for how we're actually going to go and investigate into that aeroplane. Our role is to make sure that plane is safe, is in line with regulations for both the registry that the aircraft's currently on and for the aircraft registry it's moving on to if it is going through a re-registration process. It meets every airworthy process that the OEM sets. So from our side, as an Embraer approved service centre, we would make sure that aeroplane is in accordance with the Embraer aircraft maintenance manuals. The contact centre are happy. Embraer are content that that aeroplane is being released at the same standard that they would. A key thing that I've been in flight for a year now, and it's my first exposure into the corporate aviation industry. So I've come in completely blind to preconceptions, pre-ideas on maintenance and business jet world completely. And it's airworthy versus non-airworthy. We touched on it this morning about, is airworthy what we're looking for, or is it the aircraft is in a certain condition? Now, to us, airworthy is the fundamental. Is it safe, correct or not? But also the non-airworthy is just as important sometimes to the buyer. If you're going to go and buy a new aircraft, the buyer, the priority for that buyer or the company isn't necessarily all of the exterior features. It's the interior side of it. It's, are the lights working? Is the internet working? All these things that would be captured in the APA. But our role is to then obviously make sure that plane is fit for purpose as much as we're asked to. We make recommendations, of course, to the buyer of things that they can do in the long run. And that's where, as an MRO, I see our business opportunity. So I spoke to a few brokers on the phone, and PPIs are referred to as a cash cow for MROs. I can absolutely assure you from our perspective, they're nowhere near as commercially driven as they're made out to be. We make the money on the 12, 24, 36, 96-month check that follows that aeroplane in a year's time, 2 years' time. To me, this is our opportunity to build the relationship with the buyer, to build a good reputation of the services we deliver, but not to make loads of money. Unless there are issues, of course, there are margins in rectification work. That happens if you come in for a 96-month check or a PPI. It doesn't change. But all we're highlighting in a PPI is the issues we're asked to look into, to make sure the buyer's buying what it is they believe they should be buying, and the seller is selling something that's actually as they agreed that it would be. Boroscopes, it's been mentioned a couple of times. It was mentioned by the brokers I spoke to prior to coming of where do we get the kind of expectation of what a boroscope is. Now, from our side, we go back to the engine provider OEM, so Rolls-Royce, Pratt & Whitney, whoever it may be, and they send through what is required for the boroscope. So it's not our engineers deciding that we're going to look in an in-depth of the boroscope. It will come from the maintenance provider or the OEM. If it's on package or a program, they will feed to us what it is they want us to look into. But I think that's a misconception at the moment, or at least from what I've seen over the last 5 or 6 airplanes we've done, where we'll do a boroscope and it will be questioned as to why we've done it. Now, it's A, in the inspection list that's been signed for by both sides and paid for, and B, it's as directed by the OEM or the maintenance provider. And the mindset. So that's going back to that kind of cash cow mindset that can be around in the industry. Now, the mindset for our side is we get that aircraft in and we get it back out as quickly as we can. So for me, the quicker we can get it in, fixed, back out flying, I can bring another plane in. And the money comes from the rotation of more aircraft, not one aeroplane sitting there for 3, 4, 5 weeks doing a little bit of work here and there, fixing small issues that we found. It's get those fixed within the supply chain constraints, within the manpower constraints, but also how quickly can we get it back out in the air. They're not designed to sit on the floor. We've had some that sit with us for 4 or 5 weeks with the FBO, go and turn it on to fly it out again, and there's issues everywhere. So the sooner we can get it in, get it back airworthy, get it into that sale point, get the re-registration done, all of the process that you need to do, and get it back in the air, the better, really. I'll go through a level 1, 2, and 3 as a broad brush overview for context of how we scale it, and then happily open up to questions on the MRO side. I'm sure there will be. If we can go on to the next slide, please. So there's 3 slides of exactly the same. So to us, I have to simplify everything in my head, so I brief it to how I would understand it. So what we now give to a broker or to the buyer and the seller is a breakdown in a very, very simple format. So a legacy 650 PPI, there's 3 levels that are given by Embraer. We've turned those into 3 packages as such. And you can see then the scope or the complexity of a level 3 and also the very vague overview of a level 1. So a level 1 will traditionally see on the back of a 144-month check, the aircraft's already been stripped right down in the last 12, 18 months. Doesn't mean it's going to be immaculate, because there will be areas that we look in a PPI that the 144 wouldn't have looked into. But we know as a broad brush it will have been with a maintenance facility that will have met all the regulations of the aircraft registry, so therefore we're expecting it to be in good condition. But we wouldn't make any recommendations. We would say, here's your 3 options. That is entirely down to the buyer and their advice from their engineering department or operator support as to where they want to be. But you can clearly see, as you go up through the levels, the downtime increases on the inspection work, which naturally has a knock-on effect again to when that aircraft actually becomes serviceable again. We know from experience, you do a level 3 on a legacy 650, there is around 2 to 4 weeks worth of rectification work on top of that. That's not us saying that as a minimum, but something I've strided myself on is giving a realistic date of when that aeroplane would be ready. Because to everyone in the room, PPI takes 10 days. You want the aeroplane on day 11 flying wherever it's going. Whereas from experience, and as the maintenance side of it, I want to try and educate that forum to it isn't going to be ready on day 11 unless it's perfect. If that airplane's amazing, you'll get it straight back. But realistically, if it's been operating in certain climates around the world and it hasn't been looked after by an approved service centre or by a detailed service centre which exists out there, there are going to be little issues. And it's how do we manage that expectation of the buyer who doesn't want to pull out on day 12 because it's taken 2 days longer than we said it would. It's how long does it really take? And if we can just skip through to the next slide and then the one after as well, you can see the scope of work that's covered and where it's broken into. So traditionally, the work order will just be a breakdown of everything. So what I've tried to do is segment it into what part of the aeroplane are we looking at, where does it feature in the aeroplane, just for a simple view. And I think it goes a long way to the buyer and the seller, who the seller wants to just get rid of that aeroplane as fast as they can. The buyer might be buying his first aeroplane. And we've seen this a few times now where they come in as a buyer, they haven't really got any maintenance representation, and they just want to try and understand broad brush what it is they're actually paying for. And this is to try and simplify exactly what it is you get in. If we can go on to the last slide from my side, please. One more.
Hey, Ben, you're talking about the 10 days, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that based, if you relate it to man hours, if, for example, they are in a rush and they put double staff on that PPI, will it become 5 days? Or?
No. So because certain areas you have to look at on day 1 and then you leave the leaks to be checked, and you can only check them on day 7, for example. Or there's certain areas of the aircraft where we'll work on day 2, but you can't rework it until you've done 3 or 4 other checks that will take man hours in the middle to get to checking the last part. But yes, we try and condense it as much as we can. 10 days is a buffer. We say 10 days because that's how long it should take if we do everything methodically as per the aircraft maintenance manuals. But there are always ways of trying to put other bits in at the same time. But within that 10 days, something that we try and do that I know most facilities now try and do as well is start rectifying issues before that. So something we see is on day 10, because the seller's still going to need to make these fixes before they can fly the aeroplane, because it's now been raised as an airworthy defect. So if the buyer pulls out, the aircraft still has that defect. So it's either going to go on an MEL or it needs fixing before they fly their own aeroplane again anyway. So what causes the biggest delays is examples where approvals, we can find an issue on day 1. And we can find it before the aircraft comes in normally. They land with defects. And it will be, we'll go back very early to the broker or to the seller directly of, we found problem A, it needs fixing, and it will take, they won't do anything until the end of the inspection. And the problem with that is if we can start rectifying stuff, your additional time after 10 days is already swallowed up and we're already consuming that rectification work as we go. If you wait until day 10 and approve everything at the end, we're then ordering parts. We're then doing the rectification work. If they're not available, you're then waiting. That 10 days becomes 20, becomes however many for lead times. Whereas if you approve it on day 2 and it takes 10 days to come, we're already well ahead of schedule. We've seen examples where people are on site and approve stuff immediately, and that aeroplane is back in the air within a couple of weeks because of the rectification work. Others wait 10 days, don't do anything until the end of the inspection, and then wonder why there's another 2-3 week lead time after, because they haven't approved things as we've gone along. Records reviews, paint surveys. So there's stuff that obviously we're mandated to do, and then the records reviews, ignore the price, and this is an old document, but it's something that we try and offer to give that all-round care and support. However, most people will have a representation from the buyer's side that will do the documentation reviews, but it's just how can we start to add that full service and wraparound. This list is a basic, so when the APA is signed, they'll sign to a level 1, level 2, level 3, and of course people can add stuff, and that's where we see the most conflict is the buyer will want the thrust reversers on a Praetor heavily looked into because they're known for corrosion, but the seller will be like, well, it's not on any of the lists, so we're not doing it. We had an aircraft 4 months ago in exactly that situation where it was a new aircraft, or newish, but it had been thrashed and flown loads and loads, had the mod for the thrust reversers, and then the buyer said, well, actually, I want the thrust reversers looked at. It was approved that they'd be looked at, but there was no approval of who was going to rectify if there was a big issue. Thankfully, the MSP provided the financial cover, but that put the aircraft on the ground for about 8 weeks for the rectification work. And that held the whole sale up. And apart from, we managed to put, well, the broker managed to put an agreement in place that the sale would go through at the end of the inspection with a caveat that the thrust reverser repair would be done in conjunction, but the sale was going to go through because the seller needed the funds to go and buy their next aeroplane, and it was that kind of chicken and egg. They couldn't wait all the way through for the repair because it was going to take so long, and the buyer wanted the aeroplane, and the seller needed the aeroplane sold so they can move on to their sale. It was kind of that, we said about back-to-back, it was a slightly different version, but it was that kind of house-style completion process where they needed to move theirs on to buy the next one. That's a short overview. I didn't know how much detail we want to go into. The slides are available, I think, in the pack-up anyway, just as a kind of a context. Every airplane's different, but fundamentally we try and simplify to one of 3 levels. I know Bombardier go up to 4 or 5 or 6 levels now. I mean, I don't know how much we add to it, but it's trying to be as simple as it can, because at the end of the day, we want the aeroplane back out as well. We want to help build that relationship with the buyer and the seller, because the seller's buying a new airplane, they might well be buying something else in our capabilities, and it's how do we get that in as easily and as smoothly as we can and get it back out flying so we can then see it again in 12, 24 months' time for maintenance. That's where we earn our money, and that's where we do well, not bringing it in and giving it a quick overview before moving it on. But if anyone's got any questions, MRO-wise, please feel free to dive in. Or
what pricing range are we looking at with those 3 levels, typically?
It completely varies on the aircraft. So everything is done by man-hour. So for these 3, we have a fixed price, and they range by around £10,000 each, starting at a level 1 for a Legacy 650 is around £30,000 sterling. But that's reflected in the hours that are put onto it, and it goes up. But it depends on what the airplane is and how much detail it's going into, obviously, and the location.
The
Their
task,
record review, a 10-year-old or 20-year-old aircraft versus a 2-year-old aircraft.
Yeah.
6,000 is fixed price. The amount of paperwork on a 20-year-old aircraft is a bit of a small room, right?
Absolutely. So, yeah, that's a subcontract. So we don't do the record. We don't have a Part M anymore in flight. So we have a camo that we use, and we've got an agreement with them that they step in and do the records reviews. But like I said, that caught me off there slightly because I've not seen a fixed price to any of them because we now just introduce the camo who does the records reviews on our behalf or on behalf of the buyer.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Just from a broker's point of view, one thing that you as MRO have to be careful of is effectively the PPI is paid for by the buyer. It's not paid for by the seller.
Mm-hmm.
In the contract, there's normally something in there that says upon completion of the PPI, the buyer will make the report available to the seller within 2 business days, 3 business days, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
One thing from a broker's side that gets very difficult is when the MRO starts reporting back to the seller what they're finding through the PPI process. That makes it difficult because then the seller emotionally starts counting dollars every day, because every day there's something that comes back.
Yeah.
Technically, although you would go back to the camo to get permission to do the PPI and get your approvals then, you should go back and get the approvals as a lump there and then do the PPI, present the report to the buyer. Whether that report goes to the seller is nothing to do with the MRO. That's bound down to the contracts in between the lawyers and the brokers and the 2 principals.
Mm-hmm.
So communication-wise, your communication should be to the buyer's party in reference to the PPI.
Is that the fire alarm?
Either Saved by the Bell or...
Yeah. Oh, no you're not.
Yeah, so the challenge we have is normally there'll be a representation on both sides of the house in the facility. Yeah. So it depends on who's pushing the sale through the most. If the seller wants that airplane moved on really quickly, we've had instances where they base themselves pretty much in our technical services department. And as the engineer comes in to give an update, they're stood there and they're like, yep, get it done now.
But are you aware what happens at the end of a PPI report, contractually?
No.
So what happens is, at the end of the PPI, there is a technical acceptance certificate, and then, like Brendan explained, the buyer then lists the defect rectifications that they require in order for that to be done, and that is sent back. So it also gets complicated when and I've had this many times, where an MRO will go back to the seller and say, look, we found this corrosion, it needs sorting, so we're just going to do it now. And what it does is it throws out the process, because when you get to the end, the buyer presents a list, but the seller's already started half of it already, and the whole lot just gets completely messed up.
So the way we've seen those instances happen is our approvals sheet goes to both. So when we first bring the aircraft in, we have a pre-input meeting with everybody involved. Yeah. So we'll need to know who the seller is, we need to know who the buyer is. And if there is a broker in there, which sometimes there is, other times they've already popped out and they'll be back when it's all finished. And that's where we have our biggest challenge, is who do we go to? Yeah. And we've seen quite a lot of them, in fairness. Yeah. And we will be told at that stage, I see that as kind of like a contract setting of communications. And it will be, right, you go directly to the seller and you raise this up. And sometimes the seller will mandate that they're looped in right from the start. So when we send a daily update, it will quite often go to both sides of the house. Because for us, we're being pressured by the buyer to get the aeroplane ready, get it fixed, get it out. And the seller is holding it up. But no one knows that. They see that as the MRO's holding it up because we haven't done the work.
Lean on the contract.
Yes.
So my advice would be to go back to them and say, please follow your contract. What does your contract say?
Yeah, and that's where for us it's key. Now the technical acceptance, we've seen 4 or 5 airplanes recently get technically accepted with the caveat that the money sat in escrow from the buyer and they hold it in there until the rectification work's done. If the approvals is really slow, communication from the seller side is really slow, I don't know the maths behind it. All we get told is the money's available, do the work, and the money will be fit it out as we see fit. The problem is when it takes so long to get the approvals. Now, if we wait until day 10, that's absolutely no problem at all. But the aeroplane's then sitting in a maintenance facility, not doing anything. Because if it takes 3, 4, 5 days for the seller to argue with Embraer or with whoever it may be under who's covering what, that's 5 days further down the line before we've actually done any work.
But your following issue from that is if you start the work straight away, you get to day 9.5, and all of a sudden there is some massive issue found with the aircraft that the buyer's going to back out.
Yep.
The sellers unnecessarily started work rectifying an aircraft that they maybe didn't need to.
So the only thing they would be doing is airworthy. So they would need to do it, regardless of if there is a sale or not. That airplane still needs. So that's the only caveat we would have, and we don't have any jurisdiction to it at all. It will be, here's a list of what you need to do. If you say yes on Monday, we'll start fixing it. If you say yes a week on Monday, we'll start fixing it. It makes no odds to us, other than the aircraft's just delaying, and it's obviously then starting to have a knock-on effect to it's sitting in our MRO for longer than it needs to. The cost implications with that from all sides of the house, and delays. But delays are normal in a PPI. I think I've not seen one yet. It finishes on the 10-day inspection, but it's still there a week and a half, 2 weeks later, regardless, because you're waiting for parts. Because we don't have everything on the shelf, and every aeroplane's got a new surprise without fail.
Yeah.
So the buyer selects the MRO to do the PPI, is that correct?
Yes. Well, they'll agree. I believe the buyer makes a recommendation of which one to use, and then it's agreed.
Well, sometimes the seller has a requirement.
Yeah.
Depending on what kind of, you could be seller in China, buyer in the US. You've got to find somewhere in the middle that meets both parties.
It's a negotiation point, isn't it?
Yeah.
So,
And sometimes you've got customer-owned MROs for the seller, so clearly it needs to be moved away from there. Or if the buyers agree, it will be done there. But normally we see airplanes come in for a PPI that we don't see routinely because they use maintenance facilities elsewhere, and they'll come to us specifically as a customs warehouse, and also because we can deliver a unique, unrelated service where we don't have any agendas to either airplane before or after.
Yeah.
When you do PPIs, do you actually, I'm sure, blend in the PPI with scheduled maintenance coming for the aircraft? So whatever tasks you do, you probably incorporate them in the camp or whatever maintenance scheduling.
So we can do, yes. So we've got one at the moment with us that's in a 12 and 36th month check, as well as a PPI. But the PPI is normally tailored. They'll normally have a level 1 PPI on that because all the other areas are already being looked at that are signed off. But if, for whatever reason, they wanted to have a level 3 on it at the same time, yes, we'd already have access to the areas and we would do the cards together, but they would all be signed off separately, so it would still pass a PPI. So it wouldn't have, its 12 and 36 month check would be done separately on paper. Now, whether we can, for cost reasons, bring that down for the customer of, we're doing both at the same time is brilliant. But legally, we will do one card or work card for the 12, 24 month check, and then we'd also do the PPI card as well. So legally, the PPI is still completely finished on its own, but obviously it's been dovetailed with an inspection at the same time. We used to do it where we did one check, walk away, fix it, put it all back together, walk off, and then go and do the PPI, which just seemed absolutely berserk. So we now try and blend them in, but making sure that they're both signed separately by a certified engineer.
And can I ask you, if you were buying an aircraft legacy, which one would you do? And would you listen to a broker who says you don't need to do any of these because it's just gone through a 36? What I'm trying to get at is, what does an MRO recommend to a buyer? Because I've heard that the 36 month doesn't do what the PPI does, level 3, level 4.
Mm-hmm. So inspections will look at certain areas that Embraer have directed is due to be looked at in 3 years. Every 3 years you need to look at area A. The PPI looks at everything as it's required to be at a minimum standard. I relate it to cars, and when you go and buy a used car, you'd buy an approved used car from Audi as opposed to from a Joe Bloggs on the main road, because you know it's had that detailed look at that time. Personally, if you're buying an aeroplane, you want to make sure you're getting exactly what it is you think you're buying. Now, if you're in a rush and you want that aeroplane, and it's just come off a huge check and it's got programs, I can see why people would lean towards a level 1 or a level 2. But our recommendation when people say, a buyer rings and says, I'm buying a plane, never had one before, what am I doing? Our recommendation is level 3, because then they know they're buying the finished article. And that's a minimum is a level 3 for us. And then it would be, we also recommend you add commonly found areas in 144-month check. If it's a 10-year-old aeroplane, it's 2 years away from its biggest check, we would say, we highly recommend you look at this, because 12 years we always find these issues, so it might be worth looking there. Now, that's completely up to them to thrash out with the seller and the agreement, but for us, a level 3 is, if you want to buy your new corporate tool or your toy or whatever it may be, you need to make sure it's perfect when you get delivery of it. And that's what we try and do. Is it's not brand new, but it's as close to.
Just a quick question about the levels. Obviously, it's very clear that there are obviously levels, but with the mention 1, 2 and 3, on a particular topic about going into all 1, 2 and 3, does that level vary in terms of the detail that you go into depending on 1, 2 or 3? So there was one couple of slides ago where we all shared the same level, whether it's all covered.
Yeah.
Would a level 1 coverage be less in depth than level 3, or would they just be the same?
So if it's the same part, it will be exactly the same level of inspection. But there will obviously be other areas associated to that part in the level 3. So, for example, if you open up the interior and you take one of the cabins off to check all the infrastructure or the lighting system, with level 3 you'll be checking the lights and you'll also be checking all of the other cables in there. You wouldn't just be looking at that one area. But if it's a level 1 as well, it's all being looked at in the same depth, but you're only looking at that one bit. Whereas the level 3 would take you to that second, third order effect of that part.
I mean, I'm not a technical guy, but we've got a technical department in our operation. Do you ever find instances where you're sort of the battles where you operate a technical team, so the fleet manager and the MRO, to effectively go for the same coverage? Both parties would technically be right in saying it needs to be at this level, but is there a line where you sort of have to draw it, or just to effectively please the customer to go, okay, we'll go that extra step just to make sure we can keep you happy and sort of potentially improve our business?
No, so we go with whatever it is we've been asked and signed in our commercial proposal to do. Now, if there can be a proof of agreement between both sides, that we will look into it. So we do a general visual inspection on everything, even a level 3 is a general inspection. There is such a thing as a detailed inspection, but it isn't priced. So it will be as an agreement of both parties that it will be a level 3 with a detailed visual inspection, which means they get an extra magnifying glass, in my head, an extra magnifying glass out to look in further detail. But that isn't structured as per what's agreed and signed for by the buyer, and then initially agreed through the APA with the seller, is a structured plan where the engineers have a printout of exactly what it is they're looking at, and they don't deviate from that. It's black and white, look at that, don't look anywhere else, move on to the next bit.
Can we move on?
Yeah, sorry, Brandon, I've stolen it.
We'll answer more questions at the end, but we've got a little bit to get through yet. So we've got various different parties involved in the PPI. We've said the MRO works on behalf of the buyer, but the defects are paid for by the seller, basically. And I'm going to whiz through this quite fast. The level of PPI is a negotiable thing. Clearly, a seller will not want a very intrusive PPI, because if you look in aviation, you will find, and they'll find the defects, and the cost of rectifying them will be much higher on a level 3 PPI than it would be on a level 1, simply because they're looking in more places to find the defects. So there's always a negotiation, and that will come down to how desperate is the seller to sell the aeroplane, how much does the buyer want it done, where do they meet in the middle in terms of the level. So that's a very negotiable point, and I'm sure Mark and Aoife have been involved in those negotiations on many occasions, and anybody who's doing that work. Okay, so that covers that. It's not just the cost of the parts, the labour and the freight also all come into this. All going to go down to the account of the seller. Okay, and just looking this one through, I think we've covered quite a lot of this now. Okay. From an airworthiness perspective, the seller is only required to rectify those unless that clause is in there that all systems are working properly. in which case, it can get a bit contentious if it's about a monitor that needs replacing or something like that. Yeah, we've covered that. Next slide, please. Okay. So I think we touched on this slightly earlier on. Some of these defects that get found will stop that aircraft from either flying away or being sold to another person. So the seller really doesn't have a lot of alternative but to fix anything that is found as a defect that is an airworthiness issue. Okay. A defect is anything that is outside of tolerances, and the tolerances are well written into the manuals, aren't they?
Yeah.
So it's either within tolerances or it's not. There's no grey area. There's no kind of let's keep watching it for another 500 hours like you get on engines. So the parts of an airframe are either within tolerances or not. Okay. We've covered that. Okay. So as I said, it can get a bit contentious, and deals can fall over if the communication isn't great between buyer and seller. Next slide, please. Next slide. Oh, sorry. So borescopes. Okay, we've mentioned this a few times now. If an engine is enrolled on an engine program, okay, quite often the provider of that program will actually say, no, you can't do a borescope. It's covered by the program. You don't need to look. The borescope schedules will be all adhered to in the future. You just need to buy the aircraft and rely on the engine program. Okay. Sometimes that is not enough for the buyer. Okay. And in which case they'll insist on it, and then it's down to the seller whether they agree to it or not. But I think if anything is found when the borescope is put in, then the program providers will often say it's not going to be covered. And it's down to the seller at that point to pay for the rectification. So this is a really contentious point, and it can be very difficult to resolve. Okay, but the cost of opening up an engine because you've found erosion on the turbine blades or whatever can be extremely high, running into millions. Okay, so I think this is a very difficult area. It has to be trodden very carefully in terms of whether or not a borescope inspection is performed.
Why a buyer should ask for the borescope if it is in the program?
So basically, if an engine goes in for scheduled maintenance under a program, then that maintenance is covered. If they find anything wrong at that point, then it's covered, okay, by the engine program. But if you're looking outside of scheduled maintenance and you find something, quite often the provider will say, no, I'm sorry, it's not covered, you shouldn't have been looking. Okay, and I don't know whether you've had instances where someone's wanted a borescope and the engine program provider has said, no, you can't.
Yeah, we see quite a few times where the provider will come back and say no borescope required. The aircraft was in for maintenance 6 months ago, 4 months ago, and the engine was fine. Therefore, there is no requirement to borescope.
How do you cover FOD damage?
Well, FOD's different. Okay, FOD is only an inspection of the first stage. Okay, so you tend to find that the engine program providers will agree to a FOD borescope, but nothing more. Now, of course, if you open up and have a look behind the fan blades, okay, you might see something then that is a clear indication there is serious FOD damage to the remainder of the engine. In which case, then you have to look further. Okay, and you've opened up a can of worms at that point.
Yeah.
But then FOD is not covered by the engine programs. FOD, by the way, if anybody doesn't know, foreign object damage. So that's like a stone has gone in or something like that from the runway and caused damage to the interior of the engine. So a FOD event is covered by insurance. Okay, and JSSI, we do a lot of work for the insurers in America particularly, where we manage engines through a FOD repair. And that's one of the things that we do. So it's a very different animal, and because it's covered by insurance, it's not contentious. Yep.
So the argument is to the buyer who really wants the borescope, and the OEM that says it's on the program, it's not required. And by the way, there's no financial risk to you because of this, because if you buy this plane and it's on the program, and we do borescope it at the normal time, you're not going to pay for it anyway.
Correct. But then you do get the lighter programs where not all the cost is covered. So you need to be very careful that you look into the programs an aircraft is on to make sure, and some of the JSSI programs, it's always used to bang us over the head when we're on a panel with Rolls-Royce Corporate Care, and they say, well, you don't know what you're getting. Well, it's down to due diligence, because you can enroll an aircraft on a JSSI program when it's done 5,000 hours, and you can not pay a buy-in, and then you have to pay your pro rata when those engines go into the shop. Okay, so it's just a cheap way of enrolling an aircraft that we are flexible on. But so you've got to be careful when you're looking at the programs as to how much of it is actually covered. And as a broker particularly, it's an area of due diligence that you will ignore at your peril, basically. So because it will affect the value of the aircraft. If the next engine event is going to cost the owner of the aircraft $3 or $4 million, then that can really come off the value of the aircraft. Okay, so again, it's all I'm saying is it's an area you need to tread very carefully, no matter which side of the transaction you're on, which part of it you're involved in. Make sure you do this bit properly. Okay. If engines are not on programs, then it's pretty usual for the seller to have to agree to a borescope, because there is no record of how well those engines have been maintained under a program. So, and as a buyer, you've got the full risk if anything is wrong with them at the next inspection. Okay, next slide, please. So we've talked about corrosion quite a bit already today. I don't want to labour on this one, okay? But here's a definition of corrosion, okay? Corrosion is a natural process that converts a refined metal to a more chemically stable form, such as its oxide, hydroxide, or sulfide. It's the gradual destruction of materials, usually metals, by chemical and or electrochemical reaction with their environment. Okay, so corrosion, the environment is particularly important. You tend to find aircraft that have been in a very humid environment, and most of the UK is counted as a humid environment. Okay, and a lot of the engine manufacturers state the level of risk from the environment in terms of where you domicile the aircraft. So, it can be aggravated by heat, a very warm tropical environment. If the aircraft's not hangared regularly, they're all subject to corrosion. Next slide, please. So I mentioned there the environment, wet weather, humidity, extremes of temperature, and proximity to the sea. Everywhere in the UK is within 60 miles of the sea, and I think that makes us very high risk here. Okay. Another big cause of corrosion is leaks from galley equipment. I mean, I saw a particularly bad example on a Citation 10 a few years ago, where a coffee machine had been leaking consistently. No one had noticed, and it caused a huge amount of damage in the belly of the aircraft, and they had to replace ribs, stringers, skin, the whole shebang. And it was quite a major structural repair at the end. So that was real kind of damage history. Toilet fluid is also a major cause. If it leaks into the aircraft, that can be very corrosive and chemically corrosive. So, and damage to paintwork, ultimately, especially around rivets and things, they eventually start weeping, and the condensation gets in there and starts the corrosion. I know Textron, Cessna, had a big problem with their trunnions for a while. They were using 2 different kinds of metal. And basically you're setting it up to become like a battery once the moisture gets in. And I think the grease was a contributory factor on that one as well. So we went through a period where a lot of the Cessna aircraft, people were asking for a detailed inspection of the trunnions at the point where the PPI was being specified. That would always be added as an extra. So next slide, please. So corrosion is one of those things, there's no grey area. If they find it, it is deemed outside of tolerances, okay, and has to be rectified. Can be pretty expensive, particularly if it involves replacement of panels, major parts of the control surfaces, for instance. And it's coming out now, some of the aircraft now getting into sort of 20, 30 years old, we're seeing corrosion more and more as an issue. Again, it's hard to see because it's a kind of cancer within the aircraft. And you know, you have to look quite hard. So buyers looking for corrosion tend to want a more detailed inspection. And that's often the reason why. And you know, mention X-rays there, for instance. You know, the Hawkers have an X-ray program on the wings, particularly for finding corrosion. And I'll just add there at the end, okay, most hourly cost maintenance programs do not cover corrosion, whether it's airframe corrosion or on the engines. So it's, you know, it's an area that can be quite difficult for when it's found for the owners of the aircraft. Any questions so far?
I got a question. I think one of the biggest causes is the icing fluids and
Yes.
acid rain.
I forgot that.
And on the PPI, what about observation flights? This is all on the ground, right? But do you guys take the it in the air and shake it around a bit?
Well, there's usually a test flight within the process, okay? And you know, if you're looking for something particularly, you'd have to specify that within the work scope.
We put an MRO engineer on board.
So, do you? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, we make one of the engineers go and sit in the jump seat and
Yeah.
report the numbers.
And we tend to use one of our engineers when we buy an aircraft, even for parting out. We want to know if things are absolutely wrong with it, but yeah, so. Next slide, please. Okay. So just wanted to mention, you know, we've got 2,000 odd aircraft with engines on our programs particularly, okay, and about 2,200 different aircraft, including airframes as well. So our approach to it is, and I'll let you read this, okay, but, you know, it is, you know, we need notice, we need the facility doing the inspection has to be acceptable to us. We want to have one of our guys there when it's all being performed, okay? But we're not saying we won't agree to it. Yeah, basically, we want to look into the full detail of what's going on and be involved in it if it's on one of our programs during a PPI. So something to just bear in mind. Okay, next slide, please. So a few things. We've covered a lot of this. Okay, the MRO is working for the buyer, not the seller. Okay, so we always advocate that, you know, you need a technical representative there if you are the seller. And, you know, this again cuts across some of the discussion earlier on, but you know, I've seen examples where MROs, I'm sorry about this, but MROs have not been honest, and they've found things for the sake of it which haven't really been defects. And that would be swept under the carpet if there's no technical representation. But if you've got a technical representative there, they can challenge it, okay, and come to a resolution on it.
It's like every PBI.
Yeah, absolutely. I've seen some horrendous things when I was selling aircraft particularly. But so, yeah, choosing a good MRO, you know, somewhere like in-flight at Stansted, you know, someone tells me they're pretty good, okay. Yeah, that's always better than the sort of back shed hangar, you know, at the back end of Bournemouth Airport or somewhere like that, you know. It's and you know, the technical representative that you employ, if you've thought about it in advance, that they will be telling you what you need to look at. If they're the right person, okay, you know, they're worth their weight in gold. So now the APA must be in place, okay, executed and cover everything, as Aoife alluded to earlier on. You know, if it's not in the APA, okay, you know, you can't really fall back and say, I want to do this now. Okay, so you make sure the APA is in place, and this is particularly important for the seller, because if the APA is not in place, okay, and the buyer might not even pay for the inspection. Sometimes I've seen situations where the buyer has not paid because they're a well-known customer for the MRO, and it's all got very contentious because suddenly there's money outstanding. Okay, so that's a difficult area as well, but make sure, you know, you don't get left in that situation. So doing it all within the APA is the safe bet. Okay, and make sure as all the seller invoices are paid before you take that aircraft away as the buyer. Okay, because once it's gone, okay, it's a different problem. Next slide, please. Is that it? Oh yeah, sorry. Do you know, they're so similar, I didn't notice it change. So if you decide to use the MRO that has been maintaining the aircraft to do your PPI as the buyer, okay, there is an element here that they're going to be marking their own homework. If they find something they should have seen previously, okay, it can be a bit of an issue. So whilst it's, you know, there's no rule to say you can't use that MRO, it's in my opinion, if I was working for a buyer, I would not use the MRO that has been maintaining that aircraft. Again, having technical representation on side means that you know, particularly for the seller, you make sure that the work scope that has been approved is stuck to. No one goes outside of it, because if they do, they'll find more things. Now, there is an element of what's called the sunshine approach to this, which is if you open up looking for one thing and you see something else because the sun has shone on it, okay, and it's wrong, then it's still got to be fixed. Yep. And that particularly applies to engines as well. If you go into an engine, okay, to do a specific repair on an engine, and you start seeing other things because you've opened it up, then there's no choice. You've got to fix them. Okay. You want to make sure, if you're the seller, that the buyer has paid. That we've covered that. Okay. And you know, having a good result to a PPI will not give you a brand new aircraft. You're still going to be buying a pre-owned aircraft that may still have other problems that have not come to light. Okay. So you know, that what you're getting is the best possible view depending on the level of PPI you negotiate. Next slide. Okay, thank you. Any questions? Yes.
I have a question regarding different levels. Is that because of the type of aircraft, or does that apply to, you know, because we are also an American company, and it's just yes or no whether you want it done, but we don't have levels.
So,
and then the work scope, the time frame kind of applies to what is compared to your level 3.
yeah.
But we don't do legacy, we do anything up to the latitude.
I'll let Ben answer this question. All I'll add at the beginning is that the manufacturers tend to specify the levels. Okay, so you can approach Bombardier and say, what are the different levels of inspection for a Global Express, for instance, and they will tell you their minimums for each level. But it's different from manufacturer to manufacturer, from aircraft to aircraft, and then there's an interpretation by an MRO as to here's our product that covers a level 3, for instance. But
yeah, so as an approved service centre, we get given everything as according to the Embraer flat rate guide. So in the Embraer manuals and the flat rate guide, they give you a breakdown of all 3, and they give you a time that it takes to do each part within it. So our pricing is based on Embraer's pricing. So if they said it takes 4 hours to check the wheels, we put 4 hours to check the wheels in the levels. So it will give you, Embraer direct, there are 3 levels of PPI. So if you go to any approved service centre with Embraer, you will be going off the same 3 levels that we set, or you should be.
Just a quick question about environment. I've gone on an aircraft, I've moved down to Africa, only strange location. It's geriatric, to say the least, it's pretty old. My logic would state that the change in environment from an aircraft down age might act as a catalyst for corrosion. Is that something you've seen because the environment's changed so aggressively?
Whether it's the environment or not, the age definitely has a factor. Yeah. But yes, we see aeroplanes now coming from Western Africa that are traditionally old. The Legacy in particular, their average age is 23 in Africa. So they're old airplanes operating in climates that Embraer probably didn't realise those airplanes at some stage in their life would end up down there. So it's now a learning curve of those airplanes dealing in climates that they're not probably used to overly. So yes, there definitely will be a relation. And the maintenance it's received in its lifestyle as well. So we see airplanes that come to us and we've never seen them before, and there'll be loads of stuff, and it's like, how did that arrive in that condition? And you'll look at where it was previously and you'll be like, Brendan alluded to, sheds out the back of airports, they exist around the world, don't they? We all probably know they do. And the aircraft might well have been there for a while, so they're not picking up on the same things.
We've always chosen not to take the hangar route.
I have a question about the engine and the engine programs. Because I get that value depreciated when you get closer to the TBO. So in a Film 300, I believe it's 5,000 hours. And if you are buying $4,900, you will pay way less.
I agree with you if it's not on the engine program.
Correct.
Yeah.
But there are some other aircraft that are unconditioned, like I believe the
Yeah.
650.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How that changes because they don't have a big impact.
I mean, from a valuation perspective, the program is exactly the same, whether it's on condition or not. All that on condition means is that you don't have a hard time overhaul. You know, on a Global Express, for instance, you start putting a borescope in at 3,000 hours. If there's nothing wrong with that engine and it's cleared, it's cleared for another 1,000 hours, and then the borescope goes in again. Okay, and that keeps happening every 1,000 hours until they find something that is either a concern within tolerances or it's outside of tolerances. Once they find something outside of tolerances, okay, it drives a shop visit. And the shop visit is not an overhaul, it's a repair. So they go in using the sunshine method and they replace everything they find that is defective and outside tolerances. Okay. If, however, it's not bad enough to cause a shop visit, but they want to keep an eye on it, they'll put a technical variance on the engine, reduce the interval from, say, 1,000 hours to 500 hours, then the borescope goes in every 500 hours until the situation deteriorates again. Okay. So, and that's how it works. But if it's on a JSSI program or Rolls-Royce Corporate Care or whoever, whichever providers have got on-condition cover, then it's no different. It's still covered. And we know, based upon how many of each engine type we've got on programs, roughly when the average time is for a first shop visit. And say on a Global Express, Rolls-Royce will tell you it's 7,500 hours. Okay, we see about 8,250 hours on our programs because we monitor it. And that's the time when the normal first shop visit tends to happen. Once it gets to about 6,000 hours, we call it a high-risk engine if it's not seen the shop visit. But some globals go to 10,000 hours. Now, if it goes to 10,000 hours, the cost of the shop visit goes up dramatically. Okay, if the shop visit happens at 7,500 hours, it's about 3.2 million per engine. If it gets to 10,000, it increases to 5.5 million per engine.
It's almost like an overhaul.
Yeah. Well, they'll find more wrong with it. So basically, and at that point, some of the LLPs need replacing. So they won't make it to their full life, basically. So.
How long is the PPI considered valid? So let's say prospect buyer offers an LOI, the aircraft goes in PPI, and the prospect pulls out. Is the buyer allowed to say to the next prospect who has offered an LOI, see, you don't need a PPI, already did it?
Technically, it's not their inspection. It's the inspection's been paid for by the previous buyer. So that report probably is not available to be shared with a new prospect. It might be, but it's also, a question of, placing reliance on something that wasn't done under your orders and where you stand legal. I'd be interested to know what IFA says about that, because
you have to get it assigned over.
Yeah.
To the buyer. And sometimes the MROs don't like to do that because they'd rather
do their own.
It depends if the aircraft's moved.
I would say it's as soon as it takes off.
Yeah.
It's still valid until it takes off.
Until it takes off.
Yeah, 15 minutes. So, any more questions? I know Aoife's going to do a little bit after this. So, yeah.
Maybe a technical question. Is the nacelle part of the engine program in terms of corrosion or more airframe side?
So is the
nacelle?
The engine nacelles themselves, that's a good question. I'm not technical myself, but I think that like the pylons, they're considered airframe. Okay, I'm fairly sure of that. But what I can do is find out, and I'll try and get back to you on that by tomorrow. Okay. So.
Some programs cover the acoustic line, not
Do they? Okay.
Yeah, not the actual lid skin on the end, and then the cowling is all airframe.
Yeah, I thought that.
It's only-
And a lot of the LRUs are airframe as well. They're not
Yeah.
covered, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Perfect.
okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello? Okay, I'm going to try and make this as quick as I can. There is a huge interplay on the legal side between the contracts. So whether that's the work scope with the MRO, the aircraft purchase agreement, the programs, if the aircraft, the engine APU are on programs, see a lot of is, and then obviously the scope of the inspection. And they don't always work together too well. You don't have a decent lawyer on who knows what to look for. I'm going to try and give you the kind of things you should be looking for now. But let me give you an example. The programs, for example, still don't know why, and this is my rant at every corporate jet investor every year, but Pratt Whitney, to be fair, are finally trying to fix it. Your program is basically not an assignable contract, not as we lawyers like to call an assignable contract. Assignable means the entire contract is assigned over to the new party. What the program guys say is effectively the benefit of the contract is assignable, but you're going to have to enter into a new contract with us, the program supplier. And we don't like to do that until after you've bought the jet. So the effectiveness of your contract is actually only kicks off post-acquisition. And this is my rant to the program suppliers, is like, why would you do that? I mean, when the brokers are telling us 20 to 25% of the value of an asset of an aircraft is in the program, why are you letting that window for something to happen where they think they're buying into a program, but then you won't issue them a contract? And the only excuse, if I'd be interested if any of them are in the room, in fact, JSSI, where are you? You're better at it, to be fair. But the answer tends to be, well, the program that the seller has is personal to the seller, it's confidential, and the seller doesn't want us to share it with you, and I say rubbish. We'll produce an NDA, and I guarantee you the seller will be more than happy to share it with the buyer, particularly if he's convincing the buyer to pay an extra 20% for the value of the program. So there's never been much of a good reason. Personally, I think it's because they want to change the terms and they want to issue new terms. And we say that to them, is, well, just tell them that. You know, if an aircraft is being maintained in the US and it's moving to Africa, where there's less support for DASA, whoever, then yes, of course you should be entitled to increase your rates. But leaving this kind of a gap is a really big problem. But as I say, thankfully, Pratt Whitney are leading the charge. Pratt Whitney, on the other hand, are also leading the charge on no need for a borescope IFA. Stop telling your clients to do these inspections. These engines are all on our program, and you're just causing problems when you do borescopes. Back to Mark's point, yes, but that doesn't find the FOD, and it doesn't find the corrosion that we're all looking for. So what I wanted to do is just try and highlight that you need to be looking at these contracts. What most of the facilities are doing now is they're getting the buyer and the seller to both sign the work scope. Be careful, because I have yet to see a buyer or a seller that actually reads the terms and conditions set by the maintenance facility. What you need to be looking at are things like, obviously, liens. When is the MRO entitled to put a lien on? Who's paying for what? So if it's the seller's report, back to the discussion about whose report is it. One of the big issues that we've had on a couple of occasions recently, and this is where you're getting into a serious dispute, is the inspection report. So the facility produced a report that basically said, to be honest, I rang the facility, the manager at the facility, and I said, this isn't an inspection report. This is basically telling us that you need to have further evaluation, because 80% of the report basically said requires further evaluation, requires further evaluation. And what it came down to was a big dispute between the seller and the buyer, because the buyer's responsibility was to pay for the inspection report. The seller's responsibility is rectification. So I'm very gratified to see Ben's starting to streamline the levels of inspection, what are we all talking about? Same thing needs to happen with the format of inspection reports, because you'll see some facilities and it's literally an email with, here's a couple of things we found. What the good facilities will do is they'll produce a report that basically says, these are all the items that we found. This is the rectification process. If you don't have that, so in that particular dispute, it was a one-pager, and it was basically requires further evaluation. And it didn't even call itself inspection report, it was just an email. So the seller is basically saying, well, it's still all part of the pre-purchase inspection. So all those further evaluations that are needed, that's all still part of the PPI. And the buyer is obviously saying, no, that's all part of the rectification. They're saying they found corrosion, and now they're saying they have to dig a bit deeper. So if you don't have that set out quite clearly in your purchase agreement, and if you haven't looked at the contracts, you're going to get yourself into trouble. And when the market turns is when buyers and sellers tend to get into dispute more. You can see it, you can track the way the market is going, because suddenly they do care about deposits, and suddenly they do care about pulling out of transactions for whatever reason. I mean, I have a seller at the moment who has no right to pull out of the transaction, but he doesn't care. He doesn't like the aircraft anymore. This is the same guy who was shown about 100 pictures of the interior. But then the wife saw the pictures of the interior, and that was the end of that. So I want you to just think about the contracts. One of the big things I've noticed a lot is the MRO will produce the work scope. Put the work scope, the agreed work scope between the seller and the buyer, put that in as your definition of the PPI. It's really important you do this. And make sure you send the definition of delivery condition to the same facility and say, it's not just airworthiness. We also want you to check these systems. We want to know if the ADs and SBs are up to date. Sometimes it's ADs, SBs for up to 3 to 6 months post-closing. I need you to find all of them as well. But if you don't attach that work scope into the definition of inspection, you're not catching all of that in the contract. And if there's a fight, if something comes out at that inspection, then you're going to have a dispute between your inspection work scope and your own purchase agreement. So you need to wrap it up. It's really, really important to do that. Pre-purchase inspections then, these are just kind of tips. I mean, everybody knows what a pre-purchase inspection is. When and where, that's very important, because ideally what you want is the inspection to be done in the same facility where you'll do the closing. And that is very much predicated on the tax position. So is it in a location where we can either get a flyaway exemption if it's in the US, or it's customs warehousing in the UK. But if we can tie the two together, then we do, because otherwise you're back into the whole inspection's finished, we have to move it for closing. If anyone tells you to close an international airspace, I'm just going to set it here and now, don't listen to them and hire yourself a different lawyer, because it's utter rubbish. But the concept is try and do it in the same place, because otherwise there's the movement risk. So you're taking it out of the facility and sending it to the closing location. Seller says, well, I want you to accept the aircraft here and now, and then we'll close. So we'll just do the transfer of title. Buyer says, no, you must continue to carry the risk until delivery location. Now the delivery location, somebody suggests Guernsey. Turns out there's not enough engineers down in Guernsey. Aircraft goes tech en route. You have to try and either send it back or send down engineers. So you do need to be thinking about all of these things and watching the tax. Logistics and timeline. I was going to get a red pen to your contract, actually, Brendan, because the putting into a purchase agreement an obligation on a buyer to do an inspection within a certain number of days, it's not under the buyer's control. And we had a buyer one time who tried to argue force majeure on that kind of concept because they just couldn't get a slot. You need to have the slot with the facility agreed before you sign the APA. Have them committed on it. And if you follow my line of reasoning, your work scope will have been signed by the facility before you sign your APA. Put it into the APA as a schedule and rely on it. So tie them to the dates and then the timeline, while everybody wants the parties to keep moving forward, and that's why you put timelines in contracts. A lot of it is predicated on supply chain issues, manpower issues. You can't default a seller or a buyer just because the facility has found something serious and the inspection can't be finished, etc., etc. Extended inspection, we've spoken about. Test flights, that's an interesting one. If let's just say, if there is a dog of an aircraft and it goes into a facility and they find a lot of very serious airworthiness issues, you can't do the test flight. And this came to us recently as a dispute. So I asked them for a copy of the purchase agreement, and in the purchase agreement, the definition of inspection was post-test flight. So the inspection work scope caught everything. So the seller is basically saying, well, the inspection's not finished yet. Or the buyer is saying the inspection's not finished yet because we haven't been able to do the test flight. And the seller is saying, no, they've issued a report, and the report says, here are the issues. So you need to be able to rely on that. The wording in the contract basically says the report is what comes out before the test flight. But it's one to watch and to think about, because if there are airworthiness issues, seller has to cover them if he wants his aircraft out. In this particular case, the seller actually doesn't want to cover them because he's now looking at parting out the aircraft because it is that bad in terms of condition. So it's an interesting dilemma, but it did make me think about the test flight, because obviously you can only do the test flight once it's back airworthy again. Correct. Correct, or a demo flight is what they like to call it. Yeah, and when that flight happens as well, it's like, what are you doing with the test flight? Is it the test flight the facility do to check everything is working post-inspection? Or is it the buyer wanting to be on board to have a look? So when you're moving it into the facility, that tends to be, you have to call that a demo flight. Because if you call it that a test flight, you're breaching, quite rightly, you're breaching regulations. But also you need to watch things like grey charter, because if the buyer is paying per hour, per flight hour to move that, that's technically a charter of the aircraft. So that's why they call it a demo. So you have to watch that. Airworthiness, this is a term defined by the regulators, but as a lawyer, it's a very unsatisfactory definition, because airworthiness, according to the regulators, is basically the aircraft is in a safe condition for flight. What does that mean? What you see a lot in contracts is definition of airworthiness is in a safe condition for flight and has been released to service by the maintenance facility. So a lot of people are relying on the maintenance facility to determine if the aircraft is airworthy or not. The reality is, if you get into a dispute about it, the MRO will say, well, hang on a second, we only did what was in the work scope. We're not standing here telling you if that aircraft is airworthy or not. We'll say if we found airworthiness issues, and you can take a lot of comfort from us that we're not going to release an aircraft back to service with airworthiness issues. But it's not us that determines it, it's the CAMO. It's the CAMO has the final sign-off on it. So again, just watching these kind of things within the contracts is actually quite important. Supply chain, spoken about at length, they're just a massive issue. What we are seeing a lot now is the ability to reject. So at the end of an inspection, typically the sellers try to tie the buyers to, as soon as you sign a contract, if I put it into this delivery condition, you must buy it. We tend to still insist on there must be a rejection for what we call significant findings. So material damage, material corrosion, if it's so bad that the buyer needs to pull out. What I am seeing more and more these days is supply chain. So a right to reject if the facility estimates it'll take longer than 45 days, 60 days to get parts, then the buyers are looking for a way out on that. I think there's one. I use the same, I knew it was familiar, Brendan. To boroscope or not, I mean, I wouldn't buy a car without doing an inspection and getting somebody to look at the engine, and that thing drives along the nice safe road. You know, would you really get into an aircraft with your family without having a proper look at the engines? They are moving towards this. They are trying to move us all into the computerized maintenance. So basically it's all online. Concept being, you don't need to do an inspection because we have tracked everything to do with this engine, and you just need to go onto the computerized system. I don't know, I mean, I'd love to take the view of the room. It just doesn't sit well with me at all. It doesn't pick up FOD, exactly. So, and I don't even see how it could pick up corrosion, to be honest. Sorry, go ahead, Jim.
The only problem I have, and I agree with you, I think borescopes are certainly necessary, but dealing with Pratt, we did have an issue where if you do a borescope without their authorization and find something in the hot zone, they won't repair it.
No, you have to get their permission, for sure.
So, be careful if you go borescope crazy, because you may have stuck with a bill and Pratt will, in your face, say, we don't care. You have to ask for permission.
And also go direct to them. I mean, I don't know if you've seen the Honeywell MSP. It's about 4 years dated ago, but that's flogged around the market as, it's a bit like that tax advice on illegal charter. But this piece of paper anyway is sent around the market from Honeywell MSP saying, we will agree to borescopes provided you meet the following conditions. It's 4 years old. They don't agree to the same conditions now. Go straight to them, ask them for permission to do a borescope, and fight them tooth and nail on it. If they say no, well, why? Why won't you let me do it? You're now holding up the sale. They'll typically point you to terms and conditions. Again, none of the buyers ever read the terms and conditions of the programs. You need to read them. JSSI tip to tail is very different to JSSI's other programs. Tip to tail is very different to MSP. And, really, to be honest with you, what you're looking for when you read these contracts is what they don't cover. They'll all tell you it's very important, it's very valuable. There are things like deficits on program that carry over to the new buyer. So if the new buyer doesn't carry on with the program, then the deficit becomes a problem for both the seller and the buyer, depending on how your contract has dealt with it. They do things like minimum hours. So during COVID, that was a good source of dispute litigation. If you weren't able to use the aircraft because they were all grounded, but that meant you couldn't get up to your 400 hours on corporate care, but yet Rolls-Royce were still entitled to charge you up the 400 hours that hadn't been used. So that was an issue.
Aoife, can I ask, so with the digital twin technology and it becoming more computerized, do you see that there's going to be a point where we've got two sets of aircraft? We've got really new modern aircraft where everything is electronic and you've got sort of the digital twin, so you can look at that. And then you've got older aircraft where that's just not feasible. And you're going to have a real contract differential between those two sets of aircraft.
I think you have that already, to be honest. I mean, I personally do not understand how in a multi-million dollar industry, the records are kept in cardboard boxes. I mean, seriously? Like, why are they? So one of my clients actually set up Stream, which is the computerizing of commercial aircraft documents. And it's literally a scanning. He bought himself a photocopier, and then he went out to all the airlines and said, why don't I scan? And the leasing companies love it because now they can market the aircraft around the world without moving the records at all. And the biggest resistance was from the regulators who said, no, we need the pen. So you know the little pen squiggle that is basically, that's the engineers sign off on whatever repair work they did. The regulators are still at the point of, we need the pen squiggle. We want to see the squiggles. Makes no sense, not in today's world. Sorry? The regulators badly need to update, because this is the argument we had with them is, but you're a safety regulator. You know, that this is all about safety, and if you want to keep records and keep track of records, online is obviously a very clever way to do it. Sticking a box of records onto an aircraft, which is being delivered to an inspection facility, is bonkers. But apparently that's what everybody's doing. If anything happens to that aircraft on flight, you've just destroyed not only the asset, but also all of your proof that that aircraft had been properly maintained. So good luck trying to get your insurance claim sorted out with no records. And in fact, your policy will specifically say, do not send the records with the aircraft. Don't ever do that. But then, sorry, but the converse of that is you send it with one of the couriers and they lose it anyway.
Something that we're pushing to change at the moment with the CAA. We've struggled with the EASA, but we're in the process of going paperless. So all maintenance records, all engineering work cards are all done on a tablet now on the shop floor. And we've had a huge battle. We've just had certification from the CAA that then acknowledge it now, where we use Wings Mobile. We're the first people to roll it out, where everything is stored online. But EASA won't recognise it, so when we work in the EASA area, we have to still print all manuals and all the work cards to try and prove that the system works and it's all secure. But the operator of the airplane still has to print them back out. So we do it all online, email them all over to them, and it's now at their discretion to print again and put it all into cardboard boxes for all the maintenance work. So from an MRO perspective, we're there, but it's now getting the regulators and operators to buy into paperless as well. So it's.
But if you only get the CAA to sign off on it, though, you've just created a problem, though, haven't you, with the history? Because it was based in the UK, it was maintained by you guys, that was all computerized, CAA said fine, and then EASA says, sorry, don't accept this.
Or the second they move to another maintenance facility, they've got some online, some on paper.
So it either has to be everybody does it or nobody does it, yeah. So that's it. That's my warning to you all. Read the contracts, for the love of God, or get a lawyer to explain them to you. I mean, the program, sorry, Brendan, but the program contracts are desperately boring. But you do need to read them, and you do need to understand. Or what we tend to do as well is ask the supplier to summarize a kind of a term sheet or terms, basically. This is what this program covers, and be specific on it. Do you cover corrosion? Yes or no? Chances are it's always a no, but it's worth a shot. Although tip to tail does cover some, doesn't it?
I think there's a discretionary aspect to it, although I'm not close enough to the process.
But this is my other problem, though, is there seems to be a discretionary aspect to a lot of these programs, and they're not the same. So, you know, the program that one person thinks they have is not the same as the exact same OEM supply with a different customer.
I think there's no, has it been hanged and all that kind of thing. If it's been left outside its whole life,
Do you mandate washing and polishing?
Sorry?
Do you mandate washing and polishing of the aircraft?
Well, the engine washing.
Yeah, I want to fuselage anything, right?
I don't know the answer to that question because I'm not actually involved in the programs themselves. So
that makes a difference. Yeah.
I think you need to think of it like an insurance policy. You know, if you want them to pay out, you need to have been a good boy or a good girl all the way through with your aircraft. If they, if you do something that you shouldn't have done, then there's bound to be some kind of an exclusion in there.
Technically, you're supposed to do a salination wash on the engines every time you land, aren't you? To actually comply with these things. So.
I don't know, yeah.
Hi.
Sorry.
Have you seen an engine program refuse to sign it for the buyer? Or
Yes.
try to buy me?
Yeah, well, to be fair, they didn't refuse. They just escalated the cost so much that the buyer didn't want it. Yeah. And it was interesting because in the contract we had put in, thank God, because I was acting for the seller, but we had put in a clause that said the buyer, not only will the seller make the program available for the benefit to transfer to the buyer, but the buyer hereby agrees to accept the program. So we had the out for the seller of, you said you were going to take it. You're the one that's causing the problem just because you don't like the cost. It was Africa, actually. It was a support contract for Africa. And it does escalate quite a lot, depending on the aircraft type and what kind of facilities they have down there already. But if it's going to cost them more to get manpowers and parts, then they're going to charge you more.